God's chosen ones. Your anointing is too heavy. Even your enemies can feel it. They didn't attack you because you were loud. They attacked you when you were silent, when you smiled instead of struck back, when you healed instead of hurt, because your presence carried what their pride couldn't face. You were never just a threat, you were the breaking point. The moment your light entered, their lies started trembling. You didn't expose them with words, you exposed them with becoming, and that terrified them. They didn't go to war with you, they went to war with the God who sent you, and God never loses. Type 7 11. If you're done apologizing for the weight you carry, this isn't ego, it's evidence. Heaven chose you, and they know it. The silence that terrified them. How chosen ones become heaven's sharpest. If you're still watching, it's not by accident. This message found you because heaven saw the war you never told anyone about. They didn't just reject you, they tried to erase you. But what they failed to understand was that rejection wasn't your punishment, it was your positioning. Your silence wasn't weakness, it was fire under the surface. They whispered lies about you because they knew your presence would speak louder than their platforms. They tried to bury your voice, not realizing God had already placed His word in your bones. You weren't their enemy, you were their mirror, and it terrified them. Because here's the truth, you didn't fit in, because you were never meant to be another echo in their system. You were the glitch, the holy disruption, the one heaven sent to break the patterns they protected. Your peace exposed their chaos, your growth unmasked their gossip. You didn't come to obey their rules, you came to burn their boxes down. But I know what it cost you, the isolation, the betrayal, the long nights where even your own reflection felt foreign. You thought maybe, just maybe, you were the problem, that maybe your love was too much, your presence too heavy, your heart too intense. But no, you weren't too much. You were too real, and real has always been a threat to those built on pretense. They didn't fear your flaws, they feared your fire. They saw what was coming long before you did. That's why they targeted you, not because you were broken, but because heaven whispered you were about to rise. And you did. Let me tell you something sacred. God doesn't hide the weak. He hides the weapon. And you, chosen one, you've been hidden not to be forgotten, but to be revealed at the exact moment when your presence would strike fear into the systems that tried to survive without God. So let me ask you, what if everything you thought was rejection was heaven's way of loading the slingshot? What if you were the stone and the silence was the wind-up? Type 777 in the comments. If this isn't just a message, it's a memory, a confirmation that you were never crazy. You were just called, and now you're being released. Part 1. You were never just a threat. You were the breaking point, the silence that terrified them. How chosen ones become heaven's sharpest weapon. Before you even spoke, they knew who you were. They watched you long before you knew you were being watched. Not because you were loud, but because something in you disrupted the atmosphere, even in silence. You walked in rooms and people flinched. You smiled and they shifted uncomfortably. You offered kindness and they questioned your motives. It wasn't what you said, it was what you carried. See, when you're chosen, truly chosen, you don't have to speak to convict. Your presence does what their sermons can't. You weren't just a threat. You were the breaking point, the spirit they feared. They didn't gossip because they misunderstood you. They gossiped because they recognized you. They knew what was inside of you before you did, and it scared them. Not because you had power, but because your power was clean. Your light revealed what they had spent their entire lives hiding. You didn't come with an ego. You came with oil, and oil threatens those who've built their identity on performance. They could sense it, not in what you said, but in what you withheld. Your restraint was too strong. Your energy was too honest. You weren't supposed to rise. You weren't supposed to keep forgiving. You weren't supposed to still be here, but you are. And every time they check, you've only grown. The fire didn't kill me. It forged me. You were supposed to fold. They threw you into the fire, but instead of screaming, you transformed. That's the part that confuses them the most. The fact that what was designed to destroy you only revealed you. Isaiah 43:2 said it before you lived it. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. And here you are, refined, radiant, risen. They saw your weakness, but God saw your resistance. You don't explain yourself anymore. You've learned the people who deserve access won't require a justification. The ones who feared you the most were the ones who thought you'd need their approval to rise. But you didn't. You couldn't, because some promotions aren't handed out. They're survived into. You weren't just the glitch. You were the collapse. The system wasn't built to hold you. That's why it pushed you out, tried to smear you, tried to make your boundaries look like bitterness, tried to turn your silence into guilt. But it didn't work. You weren't made to blend in. You were born to break the pattern, just like a Gideon. He called himself the weakest in his tribe, but God called him a mighty warrior. Judges 6:12 wasn't about status. It was about identity. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. You were a walking contradiction to their control. Your growth exposed their gossip. Your calm exposed their chaos. Your fire exposed their fraud. And that's why they couldn't keep you close. Not because you were dangerous, but because you made them face their own cowardice. The room felt it before they knew. Why? Have you ever wondered why people avoided your eyes? Why the room got quieter when you walked in? Why their smiles felt tight, their words cautious? It wasn't paranoia, it was spiritual proof. Your spirit spoke things your mouth never had to say. And those who built their worth on lies couldn't survive your truth. You don't even have to confront them. Your growth already has. You are the blueprint they pretended didn't exist. Here's the part they'll never admit. You were the one they copied in private but rejected in public. They studied your strength, then labeled it pride. They watched your boundaries, then called you rebellious. But now they see it. They feel it, and they can't unsee what you've become. You didn't just make it through. You became what they feared you'd awaken into. Let them watch. Let them whisper. Let them stalk in silence. Because while they're calculating your every move you're walking in, steps God already ordered. You were never the mistake. You were the mirror. You were the moment their system cracked. What if your pain wasn't punishment? What if it was prophecy? What if the reason they targeted you was because heaven marked you long before they misunderstood you? You were never just a threat. You were the final straw that made their comfort collapse. You were the glitch, the signal, the sword in silence. And now you're no longer becoming a problem. You've become the proof. Type 7 in the comments if you know this chapter wasn't for applause. It was your confirmation. The silence they feared was the sound of your crown being fitted in heaven. Part 2. The Silent Weapon. Why Heaven Hid You in the Fire series. The silence that terrified them. How chosen ones become heaven's sharpest weapon theme. Hidden, forgotten. You weren't buried. You were being built in fire. Hey, thought you were gone. You disappeared. From the group chat, from the platform, from the places where you were, once the light they borrowed but never honored, and they assumed silence meant you broke. They mistook absence for weakness. But what they didn't know, was that you were never gone. You were being hidden by God on purpose. Hidden, not erased. God doesn't hide what's disposable. He hides what's dangerous to the system until the timing is divine. You weren't put in the shadows because you were unqualified. You were pulled into the shadows because you were being sharpened. Heaven hides its sharpest weapons in the places No one wants to go wilderness, loneliness, delay, silence. And there you were, wondering if your voice still mattered, if your gifts had been wasted, if your light had gone out. But it hadn't. It was just being recalibrated. The furnace of refinement. You were placed into something hotter than you could explain. A fire that didn't just test your faith, it redefined it. But Isaiah 48:10 already saw you. See, I have refined you, though not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction, not to break you, to burn off everything that couldn't go where you're headed. The silence stripped the performance. The fire burned off the people-pleasing. The heat peeled off the masks you didn't know you were still wearing. And what was left was undeniable. You. The real you. Heaven's weapon doesn't come from the spotlight. The ones who shift history don't come from platforms. They come from prayer closets, from battlefields no one applauded, from silent nights where their souls screamed louder than the world ever will. You didn't build your anointing in front of followers. You built it when you had nothing. That's why it's dangerous. Chosen ones aren't crowned with noise. They're commissioned in silence. Elijah didn't meet God in the wind or fire, but in the whisper. 1 Kings 19:12. So why are you surprised that God met you in the quiet? The loneliness was protection. Let's be honest. You thought you were being punished. You asked God if he forgot you. You wondered why the calls stopped, why the connections ghosted, why the invitations dried up. But it wasn't punishment, it was protection. He didn't remove them to harm you. He removed them because they couldn't carry your next season. You were growing too big for their comfort, and heaven doesn't put glory on what won't protect it. Climax. The fire was your activation. You thought the silence would bury you, but it birthed a boldness you've never known. You don't crave approval anymore. You don't chase connection. You don't beg to be seen. Because the fire showed you who you are without applause. And that is terrifying to a world that survives on validation. People fear what they can't label, what they can't control. And you, chosen one, you've outgrown every box they tried to bury you in, hidden like a seed, not a secret. Jesus said in John 12:24, unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. You weren't hidden like a secret. You were hidden like a seed. You had to go under. You had to break. You had to be covered in dirt and forgotten by man so heaven could germinate the undeniable. Now the roots are deep. The identity is stable. The vision is sharp. You're not emerging because of applause. You're emerging because it's time. What if the fire was the favor? What if the unanswered prayers were God's way of making sure you didn't get stuck? Where your name had value, but your spirit had no covering? What if the silence wasn't heaven's absence, but God's insulation? What if the fire wasn't the test, but the trigger? And now you are activated, not to please, not to impress, but to pierce the darkness. Type 797. If you know this silence didn't bury you, it baptized you. And now they don't even know what's coming. But heaven does, and it has your name on it. Let's continue with Part 3, the glitch in their system. You were sent to break cycles. You weren't made to follow their script. You were born to disrupt it. You didn't fit because you were never meant to. They tried to hand you the script. Smile here, speak softly there, pretend nothing's wrong. Stay small so they feel tall. Make peace with what poisoned you. And you tried. God knows you tried. To play along, to dim your voice, to shrink your presence, to wear their costume and not break character. But your soul kept choking because you weren't made to play their part. You were made to break their stage. The code you refused to follow. They mistook your silence for submission. But it was rebellion, holy rebellion, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that stares the system down and walks away. You were the glitch, the bug in their matrix, the crack in the mirror that made everyone see the truth they buried, like Moses raised in Pharaoh's palace. You were raised inside the system, but never of it. God placed you among what you were called to confront, not to copy it, not to protect it, but to expose it. Nehemiah's refusal. When Nehemiah was rebuilding the wall, his enemies sent distractions, taunts, summons, lies. But Nehemiah didn't come down. He knew the work was sacred. Nehemiah 6:3 is your echo. I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. That's the power you carry. You don't come down to explain, to argue, to perform. You're too focused rebuilding what they tried to erase. You were the end of the loop. They wanted you to keep playing roles, the silent daughter, the agreeable friend, the yes man, the sacrificial peacekeeper. But God didn't anoint you to blend in. He marked you to confront the lie, to crash the loop of fear, control, codependency, and comfort, and start something that has never existed before in your family, your community, your bloodline. They told you, just be grateful. Stop being dramatic. This is just how things are. But your spirit screamed louder, no more. That wasn't disobedience. That was deliverance. System. Anything that can't handle your truth. Let's redefine system. It's not just politics or religion. It's any structure that demands your silence to survive. Any environment that only celebrates your compliance, not your calling. And you, chosen one, you couldn't fake it anymore. You were being suffocated under expectations that God never signed off on. So he started tearing it down. From the inside out. Starting with you. You were the wrecking ball, disguised as a whisper. They thought you were just another player on their stage. But you were the glitch, the anomaly, the divine interruption. Your voice didn't just challenge their control, it convicted their compromise. You became the mirror they didn't ask for, but couldn't avoid. That's why they tried to shut you down. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right too soon. You weren't made to finish their story. You were born to start a new one. A bloodline story, a spiritual architecture that doesn't bend to fear or pride. You broke the chain not with noise, but with no. What if your disruption was the deliverance? What if your resistance was the answer to a prayer your ancestors were too afraid to pray? What if every argument, exile, and attack was the evidence that you broke the system they said could never change? You weren't just misunderstood. You were mismatched with mediocrity. You were the one they couldn't predict, the shift they didn't see coming, the glitch heaven coded into the system to crash it. Type 444 in the comments. If you know God didn't call you to obey the loop, he called you to shatter it. You were the prophecy they tried to silence. But what they didn't know is that silence doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy. Part 4. Built in the dark. Why your absence was God's cover. What looked like disappearance was divine protection. God removed you to reveal you. You weren't missing, you were mastered in secret. They said, where did she go? Why did he disappear? Must have given up, must have fallen off. But God knew you weren't missing. You were being mastered in the places no one applauds. The season they called your failure was actually your formation. While they tracked your absence, heaven tracked your becoming. The room went silent, but so did you. Everything stopped. The momentum, the platform, the invitations, even your voice. And in that deep divine hush, God began to whisper again. Because when God builds kings and queens, he doesn't do it on stages. He does it in silence. You weren't behind. You were beneath the surface, the radar, the noise, growing roots deep enough to hold the weight of your next season. Joseph in the prison. You're not the only one. Joseph had a dream. He had favor, and then he was thrown into a pit, sold, lied on, forgotten. Years passed, no spotlight, no vindication, no stage. But Genesis 39:2 whispers the truth. The Lord was with Joseph, and gave him success in everything he did, in private, in a place no one saw. Joseph wasn't buried, he was covered, just like you. Your absence was a weapon. You thought being absent made you less powerful, but it made you untouchable. God removed you from rooms that couldn't carry your becoming, from circles that would have diluted your oil, from timelines that weren't aligned with heaven's. You didn't fade, you ascended in silence. Heaven covered your rise in camouflage, not because you were weak, but because you were dangerous. Covered canceled. Let's break a lie. They thought you were done. Because you weren't posting, because you weren't replying, because you weren't performing, but God wasn't finished. He was just finishing you. In the secret place, in the weeping, in the quiet disciplines, in the nights no one knew about, you were being rebuilt, not for show, but for sheer impact. While they were watching, God was weaving. You thought your life was unraveling, but it was God weaving together a tapestry they would never be able to replicate. Your character was forged in the hidden furnace. Your wisdom came from the silence. Your discernment sharpened in the shadows, like a sword being hammered in darkness for the day of battle. You're not just stepping into visibility, you're stepping into divine readiness. They'll think it came suddenly, but heaven knows. You were being prepared long before they applauded. What if the hidden season was the holiest one? What if the dark wasn't a punishment but a preparation? What if you had to be removed from what distracted you to become someone who couldn't be shaken? You didn't miss your moment. You were being missiled into it, built in the shadows, crowned in the silence, set apart for what could never be mass-produced. You weren't late. You were protected. Type 777. If you know the dark didn't destroy you, it delivered you. They stopped watching. But heaven never stopped working. And now you're walking out of the shadows, built, backed, and born again. Part 5. When your silence became their conviction. You didn't speak to convict them. Your presence did. You walked in and everything shifted. You didn't say a word. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't expose anyone. You just showed up. And the room changed. Not because you demanded attention, but because heaven announced you before you ever spoke. They used to laugh louder, but now they grow quieter. They used to talk behind your back, but now they can't even look you in the eye. It's not pride, it's not arrogance, it's presence. And your silence, it's convicting the systems they thought would survive your absence. You didn't fight back, you let God do it. You had every reason to clap back, to correct the lie, to clear your name. But you chose restraint, and that restraint became your revenge. Because silence carries something louder than noise, it carries consequence. Romans 12:19 says, "Do not take revenge, but leave room for God's wrath." And that's exactly what you did. You left room, you walked away, and God walked in. Now they tremble, not because you hurt them, but because your growth reminds them they never healed. Your peace makes them panic. You're calm now, focused, grounded, and that's what disturbs them the most, because they used to be able to manipulate you, to guilt you, to gaslight you, but you don't react anymore. You discern, and they feel it. Your peace speaks louder than their opinions. Your stillness feels like thunder to those living in chaos. You didn't expose them with words. Your becoming did. They watched you break and rebuild in silence. Now every scar they tried to cause is testifying without you opening your mouth. They wanted the battle, not the mirror. What they really wanted was a fight, because fighting you would have helped them feel justified. But you gave them something worse, silence, because silence doesn't give them closure. It gives them a mirror. And now they're stuck facing what they tried to bury, not just about you, but about themselves. Luke 21:15 says, "I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict." But sometimes the most powerful word is your absence, because they can't argue with fruit. They can't dispute your peace. They can't silence what no longer needs their stage. You've become their unspoken lesson. They don't talk about you the same anymore. They mention your name differently, more carefully, more slowly, like it stings, because deep down they know you were right, you were real, and they lost access to what they'll never find again. You've become the story they whisper to others. You know her. Yeah, she changed. But what they don't say is how your change changed them too. You didn't scream, you didn't shame, you just walked in alignment. And now their guilt walks with them even when you don't. What if your silence wasn't for them, but for you? What if God muted your voice so he could amplify your authority? What if he taught you how to hold your peace because he was about to make you a mirror? What if every time you held your tongue, you were actually wielding a sword? You are the unspoken truth that convicts every false version of you they tried to create. You didn't have to explain yourself, because explanation is for those who need approval, and you've already been approved by heaven. Type 404 if you felt the shift when your silence started doing the speaking for you. You are not bitter. You are not broken. You're just not performing anymore. And now they feel the absence of what they never knew how to honor. Part 6. You didn't survive. You strategized. You didn't just make it out. You studied every scar, mapped every betrayal, and built something heaven could trust. They thought you barely made it out. They assumed you limped through, bruised, battered, barely breathing. They imagined you curled up in defeat, nursing wounds you'd never recover from. But what they never imagined was that while they celebrated your breakdown, you were already blueprinting your breakthrough. You didn't just survive. You studied. You strategized. You rebuilt. The wreckage became your classroom. Every betrayal, you documented it. Every lie, you dissected it. Every silent season, you observed patterns no one else even noticed. You became a student of silence. And what looked like pause to others was preparation. You were turning suffering into a system, not so you could strike back, but so you could build forward with vision. Like Joseph, falsely accused and thrown in prison. They thought the delay would destroy him. But in Genesis 41, he interprets Pharaoh's dream, not just spiritually, but strategically. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Genesis 41:16, that's you. You stopped begging. You started solving. Pain taught you what peace couldn't. Here's what most don't understand. Your wisdom didn't come from success. It came from surviving things you never want to talk about. It came from betrayal that rewired how you discern. It came from doors slammed so hard they echoed in your spirit for years. And you didn't waste the lessons. You extracted data from damage. You broke down every tactic the enemy used and designed armor the next storm can't penetrate. You weren't just walking out of pain, you were walking out of strategy. And now you move different. Not louder, but sharper. You are the architect of your resurrection. They tried to play chess with your spirit. Move you here, box you in, silence your queen. But what they didn't know is that you were building a board of your own. You stopped playing defense and started drawing blueprints in the ashes. And now you don't just rise. You design. You move with spiritual intel. You walk with heaven's encryption. You were not just saved, you were activated. You're not healing aimlessly. You're building structures that future warriors will live inside. Your deliverance isn't personal anymore, it's generational. You became your own rescue. There was a time you cried, God, when will someone come save me? But the truth, you were the rescue all along. You stopped waiting for cavalry. You realized heaven had already handed you the tools. Like David picking up stones others overlooked. Like Nehemiah refusing to come down. Like Esther walking into a room that could have killed her, but saved a nation instead. You were never weak. You were being welded, and now you are the sword they never saw coming. What if you were never the victim but the vanguard? What if heaven never meant for you to merely survive, but to set the blueprint? What if every loss was a map? What if every betrayal was a redirection? And what if you didn't just get through it, you understood it? That's what makes you dangerous now. You don't move from emotion. You move from clarity. You're not driven by revenge. You're powered by revelation. Types of revelation. If you know survival was never the end goal, strategy was. They thought they hurt you, but they actually helped build the most lethal version of you. You didn't just make it, you mapped it, and now you're walking in plans they never imagined you'd carry. Let's continue with Part 7, The Bloodline Breaker. When you confront what they worship, you weren't just sent to heal yourself. You were sent to end what ruled generations. You didn't just leave the room. You left the pattern. There comes a moment when you stop pretending, when you realize the family name is not a spiritual covering, it's a cycle. And you didn't come to protect the tradition. You came to disrupt it. You weren't sent to inherit dysfunction with a smile. You were sent to look it in the eye and say, "It ends with me." You didn't leave for attention. You didn't go quiet because you were bitter. You went quiet because you started hearing God louder than the guilt. You stopped bowing to what they called normal. You stopped clapping for what you knew was killing you. You walked away not from people, but from patterns. The altar you were asked to keep. They handed you unspoken rules. Keep peace no matter the cost. Don't ask questions. Smile through the secrets. Worship appearances. But the problem is, you had a calling that conflicted with that altar. Like Gideon in Judges 6, God didn't just tell him to fight enemies. He told him to confront the altar in his own house. Tear down your father's altar to Baal. That wasn't just a command. It was a collision between comfort and calling, between fear and freedom. And you chosen one, you didn't choose war, but you refused to keep bowing. And that refusal became the first crack in the generational curse. You shattered the cycle with your silence. They mocked you, labeled you, told others you were rebellious, ungrateful, dramatic, but deep down they felt it. Your stillness wasn't passive, it was prophetic, because when you stopped dancing to the dysfunction, the room got quieter, the control weakened, the fear exposed itself, the shame rose to the surface. You didn't have to yell, you just had to walk away. And the echo of your decision has been haunting their altars ever since. You are not the black sheep. You're the bloodline breaker. They didn't expect you to break the rule. They expected you to carry it quietly. But you weren't sent to inherit the curse. You were sent to confront it. And sometimes confronting it means walking alone, means being misunderstood, means being too much for those who normalized less. But let me remind you, no one remembers the ones who conformed. We remember the ones who had the courage to disrupt. You didn't ruin anything. You revealed everything. You didn't destroy the peace. You exposed the lie they called peace. Because peace without truth is just well-decorated pain. You were the prophecy. They never prayed for God, heard the cries of the ones who couldn't name their pain. The abused, the silenced, the ignored, the controlled. And he answered, "With you. You are the sword he sent into the house that bowed to cycles instead of truth." And they didn't recognize you because they were praying for comfort, but heaven sent confrontation. You weren't the problem. You were the pattern interrupt. And yes, it cost you. The distance, the exile, the ache. But your no has more power than their generations of silence. And now, you're the one they watch from a distance, the one they study, the one they avoid because your healed presence is a threat to the lie they still live in. What if your boldness was the first prayer? They were afraid to pray. What if heaven knew that your obedience would do what therapy sermons and silence never could? What if you were the answer to what your bloodline refused to confront? You weren't just called to survive it. You were called to shatter it. You weren't raised to worship dysfunction. You were raised in it so you could recognize it and refuse it. And that refusal was heaven's yes. Type Svenu Nifen Sitiwaiten in the comments if you know your silence wasn't rebellion, it was redemption. You are not the black sheep. You are the blueprint. You're not the problem. You are the pattern breaker. And now you don't just carry healing, you carry authority. Part 8. The consequence of their cowardice. They didn't just lose you. They lost the version of themselves they could have become if they had the courage. They let you go and never recovered. They said it so casually, you've changed. But what they meant was, you stopped shrinking. They walked away when you started healing. They got uncomfortable when you stopped explaining. They ghosted you the moment you stopped handing out access for free. And now they feel the absence, but not just of your presence, of the reflection you used to hold up to them. You didn't abandon them. They abandoned the version of themselves they could have become if they had the courage to grow with you. What they called too much was just real. They labeled your voice loud when it made them face what they weren't ready to admit. They called your peace pride because they didn't know how to live without chaos. They mistook your strength for ego because it reminded them of everything they refused to become. But here's the truth. You weren't too much. They were too small to hold you. And now your growth convicts their comfort. They didn't fear losing you. They feared who you were becoming. You became the receipt. They can't unsee you're not speaking about them. You're not dragging anyone. You're not posting sub-tweets. You're just living. And that alone haunts them because every move you make in freedom confirms what they could have chosen but didn't. You were the one who stayed awake while they chose to keep pretending. You were the one who said, I can't live like this anymore. And that sentence broke a spell over your life they were still hypnotized by. Their silence now, it's not peace, it's conviction. You became the consequence of everything they were too afraid to confront. You didn't win by fighting. You won by becoming. They wanted a battle. You became a mirror. They wanted chaos. You chose clarity. And now every room you walk into becomes a courtroom they never expected because your peace becomes their exposure. The life you're building now is a living testimony that everything they said about you was projection. You didn't win by being louder. You won by outlasting their manipulation. You became the thing they tried to break and now can't even reach. Your presence is the judgment. Romans 8:1 says there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And that's why your peace disturbs them, because you've forgiven what they still haven't confessed. You carry no bitterness, but they carry memory. Memory of who you were and how far you've come. Memory of their silence and your survival. Memory of the weapon they tried to form and how God used it to forge you instead. You are not their villain. You're the version of themselves they didn't have the courage to become, and that's what eats them alive. What if their distance was the proof of your growth? What if the silence isn't punishment but protection? What if their absence is proof that the old version of you would have kept shrinking just to keep them? You don't chase anymore. You build. You don't explain anymore. You embody. You're not bitter. You're just not available for conversations that dishonor your assignment. They chose their comfort, and you chose to rise. Type 4 Humphrey War. If you know your current peace is the consequence of their cowardice, you didn't just grow. You outgrew every room that required you to shrink. You are not their enemy. You are their mirror, and that's why they had to look away. Part 9. The voice. They can't silence. You stopped shouting. You stopped explaining, but your life became the voice they cannot outrun. You don't speak like you used to. You don't overtalk anymore. You don't defend. You don't overextend. You learn to let silence finish conversations that never honored your voice in the first place. But here's what they didn't see coming when you stopped speaking. Your becoming started talking. And now your life echoes louder than any accusation they ever whispered. You didn't raise your voice. You raised your standard. And that became the one thing they can't unhear. They thought your power was in your words. They were used to controlling the narrative, spinning your silence as guilt, twisting your distance as arrogance, because they needed you to explain, to beg, to give them something to manipulate. But when you stopped talking, they lost access, because your voice was never just in your volume. It was in your vibration. And when you started walking in alignment, you became undeniable. You were never the noise, you were the frequency. Your silence wasn't quiet, it was a spiritual sound wave, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, it demands discernment. You moved out of the reach of their lies and into the resonance of God's voice. Like Jesus standing before Pilate, they begged for him to explain. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. Because when you know who you are, you don't argue with those who profit from your confusion. The silence became a sword. They didn't expect your growth to speak louder than your grief. They didn't expect your stability to scream louder than your storms. But now, every door you walk through becomes a courtroom, and every step you take reads the receipts of what they tried to bury. You don't need revenge. You have resonance. And what they tried to shut down has only grown more audible in their conscience. You've become the sermon they never asked for but can't unhear. You're not shouting, you're shaping. You're shaping atmospheres, shifting energies, interrupting spiritual patterns, not with words, but with presence, and they feel it. The tension in the room, the sudden stillness, the guilt they can't trace back to a conversation because it didn't come from your mouth, it came from your existence. You don't need their seat at the table. You are the table now, and your silence has flipped every dynamic they thought they controlled. You are the voice of what they refuse to face. There's a reason they avoid your name, a reason they go quiet when you enter, a reason they pretend they don't watch you but never miss a move. It's not jealousy, it's conviction. You represent the choice they didn't make, the healing they never pursued, the freedom they still fear. And the more you thrive, the more their unresolved shadows scream in their own silence. You didn't ruin the connection. You outgrew the contract because the real you no longer fits the script they tried to keep you in. What if you never needed to be loud, just aligned? What if your impact was never about the words you said, but the life you refused to apologize for? What if heaven didn't anoint you to convince, but to confront? You're not trying to be heard anymore. You've realized those who carry truth don't need to beg for volume, because truth doesn't compete, it just stands. And so do you. Type 797 in the comments if your silence has become your sentence and the world is finally listening. You are no longer fighting to be understood. You are walking in a voice that can't be silenced. And now they don't hear your voice. They feel it. Part 10. The crown they never saw coming. They thought they buried you, but God was placing a crown where they left ashes. They thought that was the end of you. The rumors, the rejection, the silence that followed. They thought it would finish you. They thought they'd buried you so deep no one would ever see you rise again. But God had other plans. What they mistook for a grave was a garden, and you didn't just survive, you blossomed, crowned not in front of them, but in spite of them. The coronation they never attended. They weren't invited to your healing. They didn't witness your restoration. They missed every late night, every private cry, every brick laid in silence. So they're confused now, stunned by the glow, offended by the fruit they never helped water. But here's the truth. You didn't rise to prove them wrong. You rose because the crown was always yours. It was just a matter of timing. David and the unseen anointing, like David who was anointed while forgotten in the field. They didn't see your oil. They didn't see the call. They didn't see the ceremony, but heaven did. 1 Samuel 16:13 says, "Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David." You didn't need their approval because heaven had already approved you. In the dark, in the quiet, in the field they thought you'd die in. Your life is the crown. It's not gold, not diamonds, not a title, not applause. It's the way you carry peace that money can't buy. It's the clarity you walk in now, the boundaries, the freedom, the joy they thought you'd never reclaim. Your life is the crown, and it sits heavy on your head because of every season you refuse to die in. You wear it without needing to be seen because those who know the cost don't flaunt the outcome. They embody it. What they meant to destroy you built the crown, the exile. It sculpted your discernment, the lies, they layered your strength. The loneliness, it became your prayer room. The silence, it taught you to hear heaven. And now your presence announces what your mouth no longer has to explain. You walk into rooms and the air shifts, not because of arrogance, but because of alignment. You carry the kind of weight that systems can't hold, and they feel it. You are the prophetic fulfillment. They denied you are the prophecy they pretended didn't exist. The evidence that healing is possible, that freedom isn't a myth, that calling doesn't die in obscurity. Every time you rise, you remind them that what God crowns cannot be uncrowned by man. They didn't just misjudge you, they misjudged God's timing. And now you've become the fulfillment of what they were too afraid to become. What if the crown was the final confirmation? Not the applause, not the platform, not the spotlight, but the peace, the assurance that you don't need to chase, don't need to explain, don't need to revisit the pain to validate your rise. You are seated now, rooted, whole, silent but unmistakably crowned. Revelation 3:8 says, "I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut." The door is open, the crown is secure, the mission is now. And this time, you walk in not as the wounded, but as the weapon. Type 777, if you know this crown didn't come from man, it came from the ashes. You are not just chosen, you are confirmed. You are not rising for revenge. You are rising for the kingdom. They didn't see it coming, but heaven always did. The weapon in your silence. The silence that once isolated you has now become your clearest signature of divine authority. You didn't shout, you didn't fight, you didn't beg to be seen, you just kept becoming. And in doing so, you became the very thing they tried to destroy. Not louder, not bitter, but unshakable. Every scar became strategy, every delay became preparation, every silence became sacred space. You weren't muted, you were matured. And now you are walking proof that heaven hides its sharpest weapons in the quiet. The truth you now carry, they feared your roar. But what truly shook them was your stillness, because stillness meant clarity. Clarity meant courage, and courage meant you could no longer be manipulated, guilt-tripped, or emotionally owned by anyone who couldn't carry the weight of your becoming. You stopped reacting, you started rising, and the same silence that once broke you is now the silence that carries authority. Like Jesus asleep on a storm, like Nehemiah refusing to come down, like David facing Goliath with no armor but full alignment. You've realized you don't have to shout to shake the room, you just have to walk in. You were never just a threat. You were the breaking point, the one God hid in plain sight, the one they whispered about, exiled, misunderstood. And yet, here you are, crowned, called, calm, no longer asking why did they attack me, now whispering thank you, God, that they did, because every weapon they formed only confirmed what heaven already knew: you are chosen. So let me ask you this: what if every silent night, every unanswered prayer, every betrayal, every exile wasn't punishment, but prophecy? What if God was building you not to prove them wrong, but to prove heaven right? You didn't survive this just to play small again. You are no longer the wounded, you are the weapon. Still, sharp, sacred, type 7. If this wasn't just a message, it was your confirmation that heaven didn't forget you. It forged you, and now you carry the silence that shakes kingdoms.